At 11:18 in the morning on November 14, 1965, the first Huey helicopter touched down in a clearing in the Ia Drang Valley, 37 miles west of Pleiku in South Vietnam's Central Highlands. The clearing was called Landing Zone Xrai. It was 200 yards long, 100 yards wide, surrounded by elephant grass and scrub forest that thickened as it climbed the slopes of Chupong Mountain, which towered 1,500 feet above the valley floor. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore stepped off the helicopter with his command sergeant major, a bear of a man from West Virginia named Basil Plumley. Behind them came the men of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. They sprinted 75 yards to the cover of old termite mounds and took up defensive positions. The helicopters were back in the air within 10 seconds, rotors beating the humid air, racing back to pick up the next load of soldiers. Moore looked up at Chupong Mountain. Somewhere up there, in the dense jungle that covered those slopes, was the enemy. How many, he did not know. His mission was simple: search and destroy. Find the North Vietnamese army and kill them. What he was about to discover was that the North Vietnamese army had already found him. Within 30 minutes of landing at Xrai, Moore's battalion would be fighting for survival against a numerically superior force. The battle would last 3 days and 2 nights. It would be the first major engagement between American forces and regular North Vietnamese army troops. It would prove that both sides could fight with determination and courage, and it would set the pattern for the rest of the Vietnam War: American firepower and mobility against North Vietnamese discipline and willingness to accept casualties. This is the story of the Battle of Ia Drang, the first test of a new kind of warfare, SOTA fought by helicopter assault in terrain with no roads, against an enemy who understood that the key to defeating American technology was to get so close that artillery and airstrikes would kill Americans as well as Vietnamese. It is a story of courage on both sides, of soldiers who fought hand-to-hand in elephant grass and jungle, of a platoon cut off and surrounded that held through a night of terror, and of decisions made under fire that saved or ended lives in seconds. In 1965, the Vietnam War was escalating rapidly. American combat troops had arrived in March. The strategy was to use superior mobility and firepower to find and destroy enemy forces before they could threaten South Vietnamese cities and government control. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, was the instrument of this strategy. It was a new type of formation, designed to use helicopters to move entire battalions rapidly across terrain that would take days to cross on foot. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The designation was historic. 7th Cavalry had been George Custer's regiment at the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer and all his men died fighting Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. Moore knew the history. He also knew that history does not have to repeat itself if you train properly and lead effectively. Moore had commanded his battalion for 14 months before deploying to Vietnam. He knew his men, he knew his company commanders. Captain John Herron led Bravo Company, Captain Ramon Nadal, called Tony by everyone, led Alpha Company, Captain Robert Edwards led Charlie Company. These were good officers with well-trained soldiers. Most of the troops were draftees, 19 and 20 years old, but they had been through intensive training at Fort Benning, Georgia. They could shoot, move, and communicate. They understood small unit tactics. They were as ready as any battalion could be for what was coming. The mission to the Ia Drang Valley came suddenly. On the afternoon of November 13th, Moore's brigade commander, Colonel Tim Brown, landed at Moore's position near Playmie and said, "Hal, you're going into the Ia Drang Valley tomorrow morning. We've got 16 helicopters, and your mission is to search for and destroy the enemy." That was it. 12 hours notice. No detailed intelligence. Just coordinates for 3 possible landing zones and the knowledge that North Vietnamese forces were operating in the area. Moore chose Landing Zone Xrai because it was centrally located and offered the best access to the mountain slopes, where intelligence suggested enemy forces might be hiding. What intelligence did not tell him, because they did not know, was that 3 North Vietnamese battalions totaling approximately 1,600 troops were camped on Chupong Mountain. And 6,000 more North Vietnamese soldiers were within a half-day's march of Xrai. The helicopters could only carry 6 to 8 soldiers at a time because of the altitude and heat. With 16 helicopters available, Moore could land about 80 men with each flight. It would take multiple trips to get his entire battalion of 450 men on the ground. This meant that for the first several hours, Moore would have only a fraction of his force available to defend the landing zone. If the enemy attacked during that vulnerable period, the results could be catastrophic. The first lift landed at 10:48. Bravo Company rushed off the helicopters and took up positions. Moore and his command group sprinted to the termite mounds. They looked around. The landing zone was quiet. No enemy fire. Just the sound of helicopter rotors fading as the Hueys flew back for the next load. At 11:20, the second lift arrived with the rest of Bravo Company and one platoon from Alpha Company. Captain Heron ordered Bravo Company to move west past a creek bed, conducting a reconnaissance of the area. His orders were to patrol aggressively, find the enemy if they were there, and establish a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. Within minutes, one of Heron's squads under Sergeant John Mingo surprised and captured an unarmed North Vietnamese soldier. The prisoner was a deserter from the 33rd Regiment. Under interrogation through an interpreter, he revealed information that made Moore's blood run cold. There were 3 North Vietnamese battalions on Chu Pong Mountain, 1,600 troops, and they very much wanted to kill Americans but had not been able to find any. Now the Americans had found them, or more accurately, they had landed right on top of them. At 12:15, the first shots were fired. Bravo Company, advancing through elephant grass and scattered trees, made contact with North Vietnamese forces. The firing started as a few shots, then rapidly escalated to sustained automatic weapons fire. The North Vietnamese were not running away, they were attacking. Second Lieutenant Henry Herrick commanded Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon. He was young, aggressive, eager to close with the enemy. When his platoon spotted North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the jungle ahead, Herrick made a decision that would have terrible consequences. He ordered his platoon to pursue. They advanced rapidly, moving 200 yards from the rest of Bravo Company, pushing deeper into the jungle toward the mountain. The North Vietnamese let them come. Then they closed the trap. Herrick's platoon, 29 men, suddenly found itself surrounded by hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers firing from concealed positions. Within minutes, 8 men were dead and 13 were wounded, again including Lieutenant Herrick himself. The platoon was pinned down on a small knoll, unable to move, taking fire from 3 directions. Herrick tried to lead his men out of the kill zone. He stood up to direct fire, exposing himself to rally his troops. A burst of automatic weapons fire cut him down. He died instantly. Command of the platoon fell to Sergeant Ernie Savage, a seasoned NCO who understood that their only chance was to hold where they were and call for help. Savage grabbed a radio. His voice was calm despite the chaos around him. He reported the platoon's situation to Captain Heron, gave coordinates for their position, and requested artillery support. Then he organised his surviving men into a defensive perimeter on the knoll. They could not dig foxholes because standing up to dig was suicide. They lay flat in the elephant grass, returning fire when they could see targets, conserving ammunition, treating wounded and waiting for rescue. The rest of Bravo Company tried to reach them. Captain Heron organised an assault. His men advanced toward the knoll where Savage's platoon was surrounded. They ran into a wall of North Vietnamese automatic weapons fire. Men fell. The advance stalled. Heron pulled back to avoid more casualties. He called Moore and reported, "We cannot reach the lost platoon without reinforcements." Moore faced a decision. He had less than 200 men on the ground. The rest of his battalion was still being airlifted in. Bravo Company was heavily engaged. 2nd Platoon was cut off and surrounded. The North Vietnamese were attacking from multiple directions, and the helicopters bringing in reinforcements were now taking enemy fire as they landed. This was exactly the situation Moore had trained for. Stay calm, assess the situation, make decisions quickly, communicate clearly, use all available combat power, do not panic. Or Moore called for artillery support from Fire Support Base Falcon, 6 miles to the east. 2 batteries of 105mm howitzers began firing, placing a barrage around the lost platoon's position to suppress North Vietnamese forces trying to overrun Savage's men. The artillery fire was danger close, shells exploding within 100 yards of American positions. But it was necessary. Without it, the lost platoon would be wiped out. As more helicopters arrived, Moore sent Captain Nadal's Alpha Company to the left flank to protect Bravo Company and extend the defensive perimeter. He kept Captain Edwards' Charlie Company at the landing zone as a reserve. Every company commander understood his mission. Every platoon leader knew where his unit fit into the overall defense. Communication was maintained despite heavy enemy fire and the confusion of battle. By early afternoon, Moore had most of his battalion on the ground, but the situation was deteriorating. North Vietnamese forces were attacking from the west and north, trying to overrun American positions and reach the landing zone. If they captured the LZ, they could prevent reinforcements from landing and resupply from getting through. The battalion would be surrounded, cut off, and eventually destroyed. The North Vietnamese commander was Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huan, an experienced officer who understood conventional warfare. He recognized immediately what was happening. The Americans were vulnerable during their airlift. He ordered his forces to attack before the Americans could consolidate their position. His strategy was to get as close to American positions as possible, so close that American artillery and airstrikes would be ineffective because they would kill Americans along with Vietnamese. This tactic, which the North Vietnamese called hugging the enemy, or grabbing them by the belt, would become standard throughout the war. Get close, fight hand-to-hand if necessary, negate the American advantage in firepower by making it impossible to use that firepower without causing friendly casualties. The fighting became intense, close range, desperate. North Vietnamese soldiers charged American positions through elephant grass, firing AK-47 rifles and throwing grenades. American soldiers fired M16 rifles on full automatic, emptying magazines in seconds, changing magazines, firing again. Machine gunners traversed their weapons back and forth, cutting down attackers. Artillery shells exploded around both sides. Mortar rounds walked across the battlefield, the air filled with smoke, dust, the smell of gunpowder, and the screams of wounded men. Major Bruce Crandall commanded the helicopters bringing in troops and supplies. As the battle intensified, the medical evacuation helicopters refused to land at Xrai because the enemy fire was too heavy. Crandall made a decision. His assault helicopters would evacuate the wounded. He called for volunteers. Every pilot in his unit volunteered. Crandall flew into Xrai 22 times that day, landing while enemy machine guns fired at his helicopter, while mortar rounds exploded on the landing zone, while North Vietnamese soldiers were sometimes within 100 yards of where he landed. Each time, his crew threw out ammunition and water. Each time they loaded wounded soldiers aboard. Each time Crandall lifted off through a storm of bullets, flew the wounded back to medical facilities, and returned for another load. On one flight, 3 soldiers in his helicopter were killed, and 3 were wounded by enemy fire. Crandall kept the helicopter on the ground in the line of fire, so that 4 wounded soldiers could be loaded aboard. He knew that leaving them would mean their death. Well, he also knew that staying too long could mean his death and the death of his crew. He made the calculation that experienced combat pilots make. Take the risk, save the men. 28 years later, Crandall would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions at Landing Zone Xrai. The citation would read, "Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But on November 14th, 1965, Crandall was just a helicopter pilot doing his job, flying into hell repeatedly because soldiers on the ground needed him. As darkness fell on the first day, the situation remained critical. The lost platoon was still surrounded. Attempts to break through had failed. Sergeant Savage and his men had been under continuous fire for over 6 hours. They were running low on ammunition. Many were wounded. All were exhausted. But they held their position on the knoll, returning fire when necessary. Albeit calling in artillery strikes within yards of their own position, surviving minute by minute. Moore spoke to Savage by radio. The sergeant's voice was calm, professional. He reported casualties. He requested ammunition resupply. He gave coordinates for artillery fire. He did not ask to be relieved. He did not complain. He just did his job, which was to hold his position and keep his men alive until help could reach them. Moore assured Savage that relief would come. But he also knew that sending troops through North Vietnamese positions in darkness was likely to result in more casualties without achieving the objective. He made the hard decision. The lost platoon would have to survive the night on their own. Artillery would continue firing around their position to suppress enemy attacks, but rescue would have to wait until morning. For Savage and his men, that meant enduring hours of terror unlike anything they had experienced or imagined. North Vietnamese forces probed their perimeter throughout the night, testing for weak points, trying to identify how many defenders remained, looking for an opportunity to overrun the position. Grenades exploded randomly. Small arms fire cracked through the darkness. Wounded men groaned, some calling for medics, some calling for their mothers, some just making sounds that were beyond words. The healthy soldiers, those not wounded, fired at sounds and shadows, as every rustle in the elephant grass might be the enemy crawling closer. Every snap of a twig might signal an attack. They fired short bursts from their M16s, trying to conserve ammunition while still deterring assault. They threw grenades towards sounds. They listened constantly, straining to hear over the ringing in their ears caused by hours of explosions. Artillery shells exploded in an almost continuous barrage around the knoll, and Sergeant Savage had given precise coordinates to the Fire Direction Center at Fire Support Base Falcon. The gunners were firing a protective ring around the platoon's position, shells landing in a circular pattern designed to kill anyone approaching from any direction. Some shells landed so close that soldiers felt the concussion lift them off the ground. They were showered with dirt and debris. Shrapnel whined overhead. But the alternative, no artillery support, would mean certain death. One soldier later described it as the longest night of his life. You could not see more than a few feet in the darkness. You did not know if the sounds you heard were your own men moving to better positions or the enemy preparing to attack. You could not sleep despite exhaustion. You could barely think coherently. Your mind focused on the immediate. Is that sound dangerous? Do I need to shoot? Is my magazine full? Where is my next grenade? You just existed, moment by moment, trying to stay alive until sunrise, trying to keep your wounded brothers alive, trying not to think about what would happen if the enemy launched a mass assault that artillery could not stop. At the main perimeter around landing zone Xrai, Moore's battalion also endured a long night. North Vietnamese forces conducted probing attacks, testing the American defences, looking for weak points. Machine gun fire erupted at intervals. Mortar rounds fell randomly. Artillery from Fire Support Base Falcon fired continuously in support, over 4,000 rounds expended through the night. Command Sergeant Major Basil Plumley walked the perimeter through the darkness, checking positions, encouraging soldiers, ensuring that everyone was alert and ready. Plumley was a legend, a veteran of World War II and Korea, a man who commanded respect through presence and competence rather than bluster. Soldiers took courage from seeing him move calmly through the darkness as if this was just another training exercise. At one point during the night, civilian reporter Joseph Galloway lay on the ground near Moore's command post, terrified by the intensity of fire around him. Plumley leaned over and shouted above the noise. "Can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, Sonny," Galloway thought. "He's right. And if he's standing up, I can too." Galloway stood up and did his job, taking photographs, reporting on the battle, helping to evacuate wounded when extra hands were needed. He was a civilian, not a soldier, but he proved as brave as any man on that battlefield. Years later, he would become the only civilian to receive the Bronze Star for heroism during the Vietnam War. Dawn on November 15th brought no relief. If anything, the situation became worse. Moore had more troops on the ground now, with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry having marched in during the night from a position 2 miles away. But the North Vietnamese also had reinforcements. Senior Colonel An committed more forces to the battle, determined to destroy the American battalion before it could be further reinforced or withdrawn. At 0600 hours, the North Vietnamese launched a massive assault against the American perimeter. Hundreds of soldiers attacked from the west and north, firing as they ran, throwing grenades, trying to break through the defensive line and capture the landing zone. The assault came in waves, each wave replacing the previous one as casualties mounted. Moore described the scene later. You could hear the screams of men calling for medics, calling for their mothers, wounded men screaming in 3 languages, English, Vietnamese, and what I came to call the universal language of pain. Bullets were flying like a swarm of bees, explosions everywhere, smoke so thick you could barely see, and through it all North Vietnamese soldiers kept coming. This was the crisis moment. And if the perimeter broke, if North Vietnamese forces penetrated to the landing zone, the battle would be lost. Moore knew it. Every company commander knew it. Every soldier fighting for his life knew it. Moore grabbed his radio and called in the Broken Arrow, a code phrase meaning that an American unit was in danger of being overrun, and every available aircraft in South Vietnam should respond immediately. Within minutes, the sky filled with aircraft. F-100 Super Sabre fighter bombers, F-4 Phantom jets, A-1 Sky Raider attack planes. They came in low, dropping bombs, firing rockets, strafing North Vietnamese positions with 20mm cannon. The airstrikes were so close that American soldiers could feel the heat from napalm explosions. Bombs landed within 50 yards of friendly positions, but the accuracy was extraordinary. Forward air controllers, orbiting overhead in small observation planes, directed every strike with precision, putting ordnance exactly where it was needed to break up North Vietnamese assault formations. The artillery from Fire Support Base Falcon never stopped firing. Gunners loaded and fired in a continuous cycle. The gun tubes became so hot they had to pour water on them to prevent warping. Ammunition stocks at the firebase ran dangerously low. Helicopters flew in emergency resupply missions, carrying artillery shells in external slings, and landing at the firebase just long enough to unload, then returning for more. The combination of artillery, airstrikes, and the stubborn defense by Moore's troops broke the North Vietnamese assault. By mid-morning, the attacks had weakened. Enemy forces pulled back into the jungle to regroup. Bodies littered the battlefield, many within yards of American positions. The close combat had been as intense as anything seen in the war. Moore used the lull to organize a relief operation for the lost platoon. He coordinated with Lieutenant Colonel Bob Tully, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, to mount a combined assault toward the knoll, where Sergeant Savage and his men had been surrounded for over 24 hours. The relief force moved out at noon. They advanced slowly, using fire support to suppress any North Vietnamese resistance. They found individual enemy soldiers in spider holes and bunkers, and fought brief engagements, continued advancing. By 15:30 in the afternoon, they reached Savage's position. The scene was devastating. Of the 29 men who had been surrounded, 9 were dead and 13 were wounded. Most of the wounded had been hit multiple times. Sergeant Savage had a leg wound, but had continued directing fire and calling in artillery through the night. Several soldiers had wounds that would have justified medical evacuation, but had remained in the fight because leaving would have weakened the platoon's ability to hold. The survivors were evacuated. The dead were carried back to the landing zone. Moore walked the perimeter of the knoll, seeing the evidence of the close fighting. Shell casings, blood, abandoned weapons, the shallow scrapes that passed for defensive positions. He thought about Lieutenant Herrick, who had led his platoon too far too fast and paid with his life. He thought about Sergeant Savage, who had saved what remained of the platoon through skill and courage. He thought about the 19 and 20-year-old soldiers who had held that knoll through a night of terror because giving up was not in their character. The afternoon of November 15th brought another innovation to the battle. B-52 strategic bombers, designed to carry nuclear weapons to targets in the Soviet Union, were used for the first time in a tactical support role in Vietnam. 3 B-52s flying at high altitude dropped dozens of 750-pound bombs on North Vietnamese positions west of Xrai. The strikes were calculated to hit enemy forces that were withdrawing toward Chupong Mountain. The bombers were invisible and inaudible from the ground. The first indication that a strike was coming was the explosions themselves. Massive, earth-shaking, devastating. Soldiers at Xrai, me over a mile away, felt the ground shake. North Vietnamese forces caught in the strike zone had no warning and no protection. The casualties were enormous. That night, November 15th to 16th, North Vietnamese forces made one more attempt to overrun the American position. 4 separate attacks came in the early morning hours before dawn. Each attack was beaten back by artillery, small arms fire, and the disciplined response of Moore's troops. Each attack cost the North Vietnamese dozens of casualties. By dawn on November 16th, the attacks had stopped. Moore walked his perimeter at first light. His soldiers were exhausted, filthy, many wounded, but they had held. Against overwhelming odds, against an enemy willing to accept terrible casualties to achieve victory, they had held their ground. The landing zone was secure, the battalion was intact, they had won. General William Westmoreland, his overall commander of American forces in Vietnam, ordered Moore to leave the battlefield and brief him personally on the battle. Moore refused. He would not leave his men while they were still in contact with the enemy. Only when fresh battalions arrived to take over the position did Moore agree to withdraw. On the morning of November 17th, Moore's battalion and Tully's battalion marched out of landing zone Xrai. They had been in continuous combat for 3 days. They had fired thousands of rounds of ammunition. They had called in hundreds of artillery missions and dozens of airstrikes. They had fought at ranges measured in yards, sometimes in feet. They had proven that American soldiers could fight and win against North Vietnamese regular forces. But the cost had been high. 79 American soldiers were killed at landing zone Xrai. 121 were wounded. Some companies had lost over 30% of their strength. The 7th Cavalry, which had been destroyed at the Little Bighorn 89 years earlier, had proven at Ia Drang that history does not always repeat if you train well and fight well. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated at 600 to 1,000 killed. The exact number was never confirmed because North Vietnamese forces carried away many of their dead and wounded. But American soldiers who walked the battlefield after the fighting ended described seeing bodies everywhere, flood evidence of the intensity of combat and the effectiveness of American firepower. For Senior Colonel Nguyen Huan, the battle was both a defeat and a learning experience. His forces had failed to overrun the American position. They had suffered terrible casualties from artillery and airstrikes, but they had also demonstrated that hugging the enemy could negate some of the American advantages. They had fought with discipline and courage. They had proven that North Vietnamese forces could stand up to American firepower and inflict significant casualties. 28 years later, in 1993, Hal Moore returned to Vietnam. He met with Nguyen Huan, by then a retired lieutenant general. The two men walked the battlefield together, former enemies who had tried to kill each other, but who now shared mutual respect as soldiers who had done their duty. And told Moore, "I ordered my men to eliminate that platoon, but they met with fierce resistance. I suppose when they had to choose between life and death, the Americans chose life." Moore replied that his soldiers had fought well because they were well trained, well led, and fighting for each other. Not for abstract political goals, not for ideology, but for the men next to them in the foxhole. That is what makes soldiers stand and fight when running would be easier. The Battle of Landing Zone Xrai set patterns that would define the rest of the Vietnam War. The Americans demonstrated overwhelming advantages in firepower, mobility, and technology. The North Vietnamese demonstrated discipline, endurance, and willingness to accept casualties that would be unacceptable to American political leadership. Both sides learned lessons that would shape their strategies for years to come. For the American military, Ia Drang seemed to validate the strategy of using helicopter mobility and firepower to find and destroy enemy forces. The kill ratio was approximately 10-1 in favor of American forces. If the United States could maintain that ratio, the North Vietnamese would eventually run out of soldiers. This was the logic of attrition warfare, and it would drive American strategy for the next several years. But there were warning signs that were ignored or misunderstood. The North Vietnamese had attacked despite knowing they would suffer terrible casualties. They had continued attacking even after their initial assaults failed. They had demonstrated a willingness to absorb losses that would cause most armies to withdraw or surrender. This suggested that a war of attrition might not work as planned, because the North Vietnamese were willing to pay any price necessary to achieve victory. Joseph Galloway, the civilian reporter who had been at Xrai throughout the battle, later wrote, "The Battle of Ia Drang was the battle that convinced Ho Chi Minh he could win." The North Vietnamese leadership looked at the casualties on both sides and concluded that they could sustain those losses longer than the United States could accept them politically. They were willing to fight for 10 years, 20 years, however long it took. The Americans, they calculated correctly, were not. For the soldiers who fought at Landing Zone Xrai, the battle was a defining moment in their lives. Many carried physical and psychological scars for decades afterward. Some never recovered from what they experienced during those 3 days in November 1965. But they also carried pride in what they had accomplished. They had been tested in combat against a determined enemy, and they had prevailed. They had proven themselves as soldiers and as men. The legacy of Landing Zone Xrai extends beyond the battle itself. Hal Moore's leadership became a case study in military academies on how to command in combat. His decisions under fire, his calm in the face of overwhelming odds, his refusal to leave his men, all set standards for how officers should lead in combat. The helicopter pilots who flew into Xrai under fire, led by Bruce Crandall and including Ed Freeman, who also later received the Medal of Honor, he'd demonstrated courage that saved countless lives. Their willingness to land in a hot LZ when medevac helicopters would not establish a tradition in Army aviation of taking care of soldiers on the ground regardless of the risk. Sergeant Ernie Savage and the men of the lost platoon showed what small unit leadership and soldier courage can accomplish. Surrounded, outnumbered, taking casualties, they held their position through a night of terror because that was their mission. They did not break. They did not surrender. They held. The Battle of Ia Drang was also notable for what happened after Landing Zone Xrai was secured. On November the 17th, 2 battalions marching from Xrai to another landing zone called Albany were ambushed by North Vietnamese forces. The Battle of Albany was even more costly than Xrai, with 155 Americans killed and over 100 wounded in a 6-hour fight. But Albany is a different story, a different tragedy, a different example of the fog of war and the chaos of combat. For 59 years since the Battle of Landing Zone Xrai, veterans have gathered to remember their fallen comrades and honour what they accomplished together. They have returned to Vietnam to walk the battlefield with their former enemies They have written books and given lectures to ensure that the story is not forgotten. They have demonstrated that even in a controversial war with a tragic ending, soldiers on both sides can fight with honour, courage, and humanity. The clearing in the Ia Drang Valley, where Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore first landed on November 14, 1965, is quiet now. The termite mounds are still there. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield, but those who were there remember. They remember the sound of helicopter rotors. They remember the smell of gunpowder and blood. They remember the fear and the exhaustion and the determination to do their duty regardless of cost. They remember Lieutenant Henry Herrick, 24 years old, killed leading his platoon. They remember the 19-year-old soldiers who died in elephant grass far from home fighting for each other. They remember the helicopter pilots who flew into fire to bring out the wounded. They remember the artillery men who fired 4,000 rounds in 2 days to protect troops in contact. They remember Basil Plumley walking the perimeter in darkness. They remember Joe Galloway standing up to take pictures when lying down would have been safer. And they remember the lesson that Landing Zone X-Ray taught with terrible clarity. In war, courage and technology and firepower are necessary but not sufficient. Victory requires not just winning battles but achieving political objectives. The United States won the Battle of Ia Drang. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry and their supporting units proved they could fight and win against North Vietnamese regular forces. But 10 years later, South Vietnam fell and the war was lost. This is why the Battle of Landing Zone X-Ray matters beyond the 3 days in November 1965 when it was fought. It demonstrates what soldiers can accomplish when properly trained, well-led, and fighting for each other. It shows the importance of leadership under fire, of making correct decisions in chaos, of never abandoning your men. It proves that courage exists on both sides in war, that enemy soldiers can fight with the same determination as your own. But it also teaches a harder lesson, that battlefield victories do not guarantee strategic success, that killing more of the enemy than they kill of you does not necessarily lead to winning the war, that technology and firepower cannot overcome an enemy's willingness to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of their objectives. The men who fought at Landing Zone X-Ray did everything asked of them. They fought bravely, they held their ground, they inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, they won the battle. But they could not win the war, because the war was decided by political will, not military skill. And in that contest, the North Vietnamese leadership proved more determined than American political leaders to pay whatever price was necessary to achieve victory. This is the tragedy and the glory of Landing Zone X-Ray. The tragedy is that such courage and sacrifice ultimately did not achieve the political objectives for which the war was fought. The glory is that soldiers on both sides demonstrated what humans are capable of when tested in the crucible of combat: extraordinary courage, selfless service, determination to complete the mission regardless of cost, and loyalty to comrades that transcends even the instinct for self-preservation. 59 years later, the veterans of Landing Zone X-Ray, those who survive, remember not the politics or the strategy, but the soldiers they served with. They remember the men who did not come home. They remember what they endured together. They remember that for 3 days in November 1965 in a clearing in the jungle, they were tested and they did not break. That is the legacy that matters. That is what Landing Zone X-Ray means to those who were there.